There's this well-known Cherokee legend that often goes by the tale of the two wolves. Have you heard of this legend before, this story? Anybody? Not so much. I'm seeing blank faces, but then again, they're covered by masks, so it's hard to tell. All right. Well, there once was a Cherokee elder, and his little grandson often came in the evenings to sit at his knee and ask the many questions that children ask. One day, the grandson came to his grandfather with a look of anger on his face. "Come, sit. Tell me what happened today," the grandfather said. The child sat and leaned his chin on his grandfather's knee and shared about the great injustice done against him. "Let me tell you a story," the grandfather said. "I too at times have felt a great hatred for those who have taken so much, with no sorrow for what they do. But hate wears you down, and it certainly doesn't hurt your enemy. I've struggled with these feelings many times. It's as if there were two wolves inside of me," he continued. "One is good and does no harm. He lives in harmony with all around him. He will only fight when it is right to do so and in the right way. But the other wolf, he is full of anger. The littlest thing will set him into a fit of temper. He fights everyone all the time for no reason. He cannot think because his anger and hatred are so great. But it's a helpless anger, for his anger will change nothing. Sometimes," he says, "it's hard to live with these two wolves inside of me, both of them trying to dominate my spirit." The boy looked intently up into his grandfather's wrinkled, nut-brown face and dark eyes and asked, "Well, which one wins, grandfather?" The grandfather smiled gently and said, "The one I feed, my child." My mind went to this story this week as I reflected on our reading this morning from the Gospel of Matthew, known, as the Gospel itself says, traditionally as the parable of the sower, but more recently has been pointed out that it's much more the parable of the soils, out of recognition that the farmer, God, sows seed in a variety of places, but the real question at the heart of the text is, which soil proves hospitable to the seed? Which soil is able to produce and sustain life? Like the Cherokee legend, Jesus' parable asks us to reflect for ourselves how we are tending to the soil of our lives. What are we feeding ourselves, spiritually, emotionally, physically? For this is what shapes then how we go and act in the world. So, how's your soil? Which soil are you these days? Jesus describes several different kinds of soil, but the basic premise comes down to whether or not the soil is hospitable to life. Even more, whether it can take what was sown and multiply it, multiply the life that it produces exponentially. And this is the aspect that I want to invite us to reflect on this morning, to ask ourselves a twofold question. Which soil am I? Which soil are we as a congregation these days, right now? And how do we become ever more that good, nutrient-rich soil that produces a large, life-enhancing crop? It's been a little bit on the nose for me. I've been thinking a lot about this lately for myself because, to be honest, increasingly throughout the pandemic, throughout the past 2+ years, the soil of my soul has all too often felt hard and rocky, has all too often felt covered in weeds, neglected. I don't know about you, but when the pandemic first hit and the shutdowns went into place, we were all thinking, all right, we'll be back in a couple of weeks. We'll let you know, right? And then hopefully Easter, that's what we're shooting for. We're shooting for Easter. You remember that? In those early months, my habits began to shift dramatically as my rhythms and routine and schedule changed dramatically. There was that constant doom scrolling as I, like you, tried to figure out what the heck was going on and then what that meant for us as a church, all intensified by the political polarization. I drank more alcohol, and I ate more junk, and I binge-watched more Netflix. Yeah, okay, so maybe I'm a little on the nose for each of you. All right, solidarity. My sleep worsened as my workload and stress and anxiety increased. The isolation that at first actually wasn't so bad because, I'm an introvert, so I didn't mind it all too much. But increasingly, as the months wore on, that isolation became more and more of a burden. Relationships with family and friends became distant. And the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years. And my soul began to grow weary. Because in many ways, in that context of the past 2 years, it became much easier to focus on the fire that was raging in the world around me, to consume those sensationalized headlines meant to disturb, meant to provoke you. It also became easier to show up for others and to neglect myself, my own needs, my own fears, my own grief, my own joy. Based on your nervous laughter earlier, I know that each of us has our own version of what the past couple of years has cost us in relationships and finances and security and connection and health because of the pandemic, but also because on top of it, life just kept happening and all that that means. And I'm sharing a bit more personally this morning, more personally than usual, not to focus on myself or so that you feel bad for me, but because I knew that nervous laughter would be there. I'm willing to bet I'm not alone in the ways that the past couple of years, or perhaps another season in your own life, have led to cultivating habits and patterns that not only don't produce more life, but actually diminish it. We don't develop these habits intentionally, of course, right? They just happen as a response. It's all understandable that under difficult circumstances, whether as children or as adults, all of us develop coping mechanisms to help us to survive, to get through, right? But at some point, we have to realize that the soil of survival is not the soil that multiplies life exponentially. Like many of you, I'm sure I know this. I know this intellectually, mentally. I could have told you it before the pandemic, but it's a lesson that I've had to relearn in the grittiness of life the past few months. Well, learn much more so the past few months. That the change we seek begins with acknowledging how the soil of our own bodies and souls have been neglected, have been depleted of nutrients, have become hardened and overrun with weeds. That at some point we have to begin to take steps, even baby steps, to nurture the soil of our souls, to make changes and begin tending to our own inner being rather than just focusing on everyone else, the world around us. Changed action begins within. But again, the problem is that when we're in that soul-weary place, as understandable as it is, it's much easier for us to point the finger and focus on others and to keep doom scrolling. But now that we are in our third summer since those lockdowns, on the precipice of a new beginning, I don't know about you, but I'm finding it that I finally have a little bit of space to begin pausing to ask myself, what attention does my soul need? What life-giving things have been lacking for you? What habits, what patterns, what relationships have been sucking life out of you and need to change? What would it look like to weed and till and fertilize the soil of your mind and body and soul? What do you need for regeneration and revitalization? Again, baby steps. I've had to remind myself with each little step forward and then set back and then another step or two forward and then a step back. Baby steps is a good place to begin. Change takes intention and time, and it also takes support. And so who do you need for support on that journey? Who do you need to reach out to or to let in? And when we begin here with ourselves, God keeps us from that destructive self-righteousness that is so pervasive in our world, within our churches and outside of them. And that's the thing, the parable is only the beginning of what Jesus has to say this morning in the scripture reading. The other half is a bit more confusing and difficult. See, our churches, our religious communities are filled, as Jesus says, with those who, though they can see, well, they don't truly see. Though they can hear, they don't really understand. For as he goes on to quote the prophet Isaiah, such people's hearts have become calloused and hardened. It's like they've willfully closed their ears and eyes to God's ways. And here's the challenge in this. Jesus isn't referring to outsiders that it's easier for us to again point the finger and blame. He's not pointing to your average non-Christian or person out there who doesn't go to church. Jesus is referring to those who have come to hear him, to the religious folks. He's referring to those who do gather for worship, who do think that they are among the elect, the good and chosen few. We are the ones Jesus is challenging. It's all too many of those of us whose butts are in the pews who, though we hear the life-giving ways of God, too often we choose to ignore them. If only we would open our hearts and turn so that God could heal us, the prophet says. That is, all too often, rather than showing the world the life-giving way that Jesus lights before us, Christians and churches all too often embody, well, those most vile and destructive ways of our world. All too prone to greed and seeking power, to winning at all costs, rather than sacrificing our privilege for the well-being of others. How often are people of God manipulative and driven by ego in board or committee meetings or in their businesses or politics? How often do Christians contribute to or justify violence, exclude the vulnerable, and point the finger, rather than take responsibility maintain accountability, and reflect on how oneself has also contributed to the conflict. Like the Cherokee grandfather, we might ask ourselves, what are we feeding ourselves and our world, and what are we starving? I think this is what Jesus means when he utters that confusing line in response to the disciples asking him why he speaks to the people in parables. You know, they're just like, Jesus, you have these great teachings. We know they have great meanings behind them, but why don't you just say it a little bit more plainly? Make it a little bit easier for all of us to understand, right? Not everyone here is an intellectual, Jesus. To which he replies, whoever has, more will be given, and they will have in abundance. But whoever does not have, even what they have, will be taken away. It's a strange line right there in the middle. In the context of this story, this isn't really a statement about material things in general, as though God gives to some and then decides, no, not so much over here. No, it's to say that those who seek to understand, to grapple with Jesus' teachings, those who are willing to be self-reflective and even self-critical, knowing that they have ways they need to change and grow, that they will learn not merely information, but they will begin to internalize Jesus' message such that it will continually come back to them throughout life and change the way that they see and act. How many of us have learned a lesson as kids or at some point in life, and then throughout life, over and over, that simple message takes on new meaning and bigger meaning and changes the way that we see and act over the course of a lifetime? That seed sown, the Word of God, multiplies and transforms us with time. But those, Jesus says, those who think they can say simply, come to church, or who are more concerned with being seen as a good person than actually in self-reflecting, than in a willingness to change one's minds and actions throughout life as one grows. Such a person, Jesus says, it will become clear by what their soil produces or doesn't, that they, though hearing the gospel, have not truly understood it. Because to understand is to tend to the soil of our own lives, such that we would invariably become vessels cultivating and transforming the landscape around us, creating more and more life. If it's not creating more and more life and love and goodness, then it is not of God. So how's your soil? How might you tend to your soil in this new season? May it be so for your healing and joy, for the healing and joy of all the world.